Hey guys, today on the BodCast, I have my special guest, Dr. Michael Shea. Dr. Shea is one of the preeminent educators and authors in the areas of somatic psychology, myofascial release, and craniosacral therapy. And today we are actually talking about biodynamic craniosacral therapy and the session that I had with a practicing therapist. We are also talking about Dr. Shea's new book, The Biodynamics of the Immune System, Balancing the Energies in the Body with the Cosmos. This is a really fun conversation, full of energy and light, and just really good wisdom nuggets from Dr. Shea. Before we go to the show, a word from our sponsor. And now, from osionline.com. Are you a person that really loves to watch other people twirl Indian clubs? Like, do you think it would just be neat to be able to do all those really cool movements with your arms and shoulders and wrists with those clubs? Well, you don't just have to be a watcher, you can be a doer. Available at osionline.com. Check out Clubs, Flow, and Rock and Roll. Now, I am doing a club series on YouTube currently about my favorite Indian club movements, but these are things I'm just making up. If you really want to learn how to do clubs like a professional, you need to check out Clubs, Flow, and Rock and Roll by an amazing instructor, Kelly Manzoni. All right, so Clubs, Flow, and Rock and Roll available at osionline.com. And now, back to the show. Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength Podcast. So Dr. Shea, thank you for being on the show.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
So like I was saying, when my producer and friend, she said, I've got to interview you. She had been doing some biodynamic craniosacral therapy sessions. And she said they were the most amazing experience. And so she set up this interview, and I honestly, I didn't know anything about it, right? So I started trying to read, trying to learn, and I even set up an appointment to go have a therapy session so that I would understand it. And I want to talk about that, but first I started looking into your background and your past, and that's really fascinating to me. So if you don't mind, can you kind of give us your origin story of how you got started and how you got, from where you started to where you are now? Because to me, it's just fascinating.
Oh, well, thank you. Sure. That's interesting because sometimes I get in front of the class and I say, do you really want to hear my history? Because I'm 75 years old now. And, oh yeah, we have to hear the history. And then I'll say, well, let me think for a minute where I'm going to start, because it's a 75-year process. But I think for me, the starting point really is my military service. I got out of university during the Vietnam era, and we were mandated to be in reserve officer training, which most universities had at the time in the 60s. So I was commissioned a second lieutenant right out of university. And I was stationed actually, I should say, luckily, not in Vietnam, although I work with a lot of Vietnam veterans now. But I was stationed in Germany, and I thought I'd kind of, as they say, dodge the bullet. But 1972 was the era when the rise of terrorism started, actually worldwide, where there were prominent bombings by the IRA in Northern Ireland. Then you had the bombings that happened and the terrorism that happened in Munich during the Summer Olympics. But there was also these anarchist gangs, and they had bombed the American military headquarters in Heidelberg about a week before in early May of 72. And I unfortunately parked my car at the Officers Club where I was having dinner that night a week later, and I parked my car right next to a very substantial terrorist bomb. And fortunately, the buildings, these military buildings we were in, and especially the Officers Club, they were built by the Nazis in World War II. So they were concrete bunkers. And I'm very fortunate to be alive. And I want to state my gratitude for being here as old as I am and dedicating my life to the service that best I can to help other people. Otherwise, I'd be dead. And I walked into the building, and fortunately, when the bomb went off, I was concussed, I was knocked out. But then I woke up and I started to help evacuate the civilians from the club. And unfortunately, there were casualties, and unfortunately, some folks died. And so I helped, get their bodies into the ambulances and things like that. So it was, and I'll fast forward because that's the origin story. That's an ignition. And I call it an ignition of compassion, because the mission I've been on since my military service has been to find the compassion in my own heart, to find some level of forgiveness for not understanding how the world works, in a terrorist incident. And you see it, it's a completely unbelievable experience, and how it was precipitated. So that I call the birth of compassion. So I was destined to be an attorney. I come from a family of attorneys, and believe me, I had a first class case of PTSD when I got out of the service in '73. But Tim, back then, PTSD was not named as a condition at all. So I just got involved with a lot of recreational drugs. I ended up sleeping on the floor of my parents' living room. I was a wreck, basically. And there was no way I was going to law school, because I had really gotten very confused by this whole experience. But I got directed to manual therapy. I got directed to healing my body. I was morbidly obese. And the book that I just published, as a result of that bombing, I just ate myself into oblivion. And by the time I got out of the service, I was 100 more pounds than I am now. So my book is somewhat autobiographical, because it also talks about my experience of obesity and the lifelong search for metabolic safety, metabolic health. And because that's the era we live in right now, Tim. It's the era of metabolic health. And I should say the era of metabolic ill health. 88% of Americans, upwards to 93% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy, from lots of different scientific avenues. So the birth of compassion, learning how to be compassionate for myself first, and then for other people. And fortunately, getting turned on to manual therapy early in the '70s, because I had to pay the rent. And my sister, God bless her, she said, let's see, because you've got big hands, let's see if we teach you a massage routine, because you got to pay the rent. Because I was hanging out in a raw food commune in New York City. My parents booted me out of the house, like, you can't sleep on this living room floor anymore, so you got to get out of here and get your life together. My sister had me come up, and she was living in a raw food commune. So I learned naturopathy. I studied with a couple of naturopaths at the time, Ann Whittemore and other folks. I got involved with detoxification therapies in New York City, Boston. And then I came down to Miami, because Miami in the state of Florida had the only massage school system at that time that was teaching colon hydrotherapy. So I could get my license as a massage therapist and begin my journey of helping other people. And I could also learn the colon hydrotherapy and begin the lifelong journey of repairing my own intestines and repairing my own body. And it's a lifelong journey. So that that integration of compassion being born out of that terrorist bombing incident, and it really was born, but it had to gestate, Tim. There's a whole gestation that happens with caring for self and others, and it's developmental. It goes through, I had to get through my 20s, and then I had to get through my 30s and 40s, and watch all the morphing that goes on with self-care, with compassion, and taking care of our bodies. So that pretty much, brings us right up to the present moment. And I think interspersed with that is, I was fortunate enough to go to grad school. Yes, I ended up in grad school. I didn't go to law school. But there was no continuing ed for manual therapy back in the '70s. When I got out, there was only 3 options. You had to go to California, Washington State, or Colorado. And I went to Colorado, and I studied to become a rolfer. and the Rolfing work, which is deep tissue work. It's beautiful work. It's still around. And I ended up doing that type of work, that type of orthopedic work, and structural work. And it was also linked to humanistic psychology. So I got involved with a lot of Gestalt therapy. There was a lot of that level of activism with these newer therapies that were coming out that involved the body-centered psychotherapy. So I was right there at the beginning of the movement of body-centered psychotherapy, and one of the epicenters was Boulder. But I ended up going to Naropa University, and that's where I got my first master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology and contemplative psychotherapy. So that's really enhanced my capacity to understand how compassion is balanced with wisdom, and the necessity for a contemplative practice, an ongoing contemplative practice, whether that be the work I'm doing, which is my career of teaching others and using my hands, or just my ongoing practice of how do I stay in touch with my own wisdom, and how do I funnel that universal wisdom into my heart on a regular basis. And nowadays we need it 24/7. So that's kind of there you go.
That was awesome. No, so if you don't mind, I read when you were healing from their PTSD, that part of the process was that you found your embryo.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, can you explain that? What does that mean?
Well,
it's fascinating to me.
Well, first of all, you got to understand what an embryo is. So, and this is not a test, but so a human embryo is really different than any other mammalian embryo. It's very interesting that way. And I just to tell you and your audience that I'm an academic embryologist. So part of the manual therapy and the lineage that I teach in, the biodynamic lineage, is from biodynamic osteopathy. I'm not an osteopath. My brother is, but I'm not. But I was fortunate enough to be mentored by the lead, most prestigious biodynamic osteopath until he died several years ago. And his only mentoring was, you need to find your embryo. And so I went on this journey because I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it meant go get a bunch of books. You should see my library. I got more books on embryology, and I studied and there's two brands of embryology, the genetic brand, but then there's the what's called the morphological brand. And the morphological brand is just the study of how the movement, the intrinsic movement that the embryo makes, is what creates structure and function, the movement. And all the different stages that structure and function has, from a cluster of cells to all of a sudden you get a cranium, or all of a sudden you get you get bones, or all of a sudden you get a human heart. I do a lot of lecturing on the human heart, and I'm actually speaking at a conference, the Biodynamic Association of North America. Their conference is in September, and I'm giving a talk on the embryology of the heart. So I kept calling Jim, and he said, well, did you find your embryo? And I say, well, in the first stage, there's this process that goes on. He goes, no, you didn't find your embryo. So yeah. So gradually what happened, Tim, I bought another embryology book, because every time the teacher says, no, you didn't find it, it's like, well, I thought I had to buy another book. I bought the most beautiful embryology book. All the pictures were pastel colors. And I'm reading it on a plane, and I start crying. I'm just weeping. I'm weeping at the sheer beauty of what I'm looking of how we as human beings are a single cell at conception, a single celled wholeness. And we have this remarkable differentiation, so that we're 70 trillion cells right now. You got 70, I got 70. That's a lot from one fertilized holistic cell. And I started crying. And the next time I talked to Jim, I told him that experience. He says, oh, you found your embryo. You found a love for your body, a love for your origin. And the originality of the biodynamic model is a big deal. And finding, the formative forces that really come into play when we have structure and function. But he said, you found love. You found love for yourself. And it's true, I did. I fell in love with my origin, at the level of body, and spirit. But that's an ongoing story. But so I found my embryo through that experience. And it's very, very important, because in the biodynamic work, Tim, it turns out human embryos never quite finish being an embryo. All other species finish their embryonic period, and they've differentiated survival mechanisms in their nervous system, their musculoskeletal system. We do not have a definitive survival system defined at the end of the embryonic period, unlike any other mammal. We spend our life being perpetual embryos. And if you want to specialize in something, it takes a lot of effort. And you look at world-class athletes and you look at the training that they have to do just to specialize to win a gold medal. And in many cases, don't win anything at all, but you try. So I found my embryo, and I continue to find my embryo because I can access that information anytime I want through the power of understanding how the heart and the cardiovascular system functions.
Wow, I am extremely glad I asked you that question.
Yeah.
So along the way, also, I noticed that, which this is also cool, you were a student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well,
and what was that like?
Well, it's funny because I went to Naropa, and I was raised Catholic, and so I'm a lapsed Catholic and a fallen away. Even though I have an undergraduate degree from a Jesuit university, but my mother always bugged me. She said, why don't you come back to Jesus? I said, well, I never had a relationship, Mom. Christianity and Catholicism didn't touch me. I didn't get it, but Buddhism got me. So that's all I can tell you, Mom. So I have a degree in Buddhist psychology, and it's just another lifelong journey of looking at the self and being, in touch with the self and in my own ignorance, and coming into relationship with my own ignorance and stupidity. In terms of my behaviors and all of that. It's like a self-psychotherapy. And in the Buddhist systems, you have a teacher. And in the Tibetan system, which was the big deal in Boulder, was that they had a guru, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he was the big Meshuggah of the whole, most of the Buddhist community in Boulder. So I went through the steps, because he started Naropa University, to become a formal Buddhist. And there's a stage in Buddhism where you take on a teacher, you take on a so-called guru, and you get more linked in terms of a relationship where you can get pointing out instructions of just where you're screwed up with your thinking and your emotions and so forth. But I never quite got connected to Chogyam Trungpa. But I continued my practice, and I came down, and I was my mother's healthcare surrogate before she died. So I moved back to Florida after I graduated, and my mother died in 2004. And I'm Irish, Tim, and I started drinking a lot. I mean, I just loved my mom. It was so intense, and having that level of intense contact with her, because she was on a respirator and a feeding tube, all that stuff, and she wanted that. And so I'm drinking heavily, and a friend of mine calls and says, the Dalai Lama is coming to Miami, and it's the first time he's ever been to Florida, and we ought to go. And I said, you better believe we ought to go. I need something, because I'm not in good shape. So we went down there, and I went through a 3-day training. He talks mainly when he comes into the United States in basketball arenas, because it turns out that basketball arenas are the perfect fit for the number of people that are going to attend his talks. And this was the University of Miami basketball arena. And I had nosebleed seats. I don't need to be up close to the guru, just because they got the Jumbotron, just like the big Christian churches do. You can go in. And so there's the Jumbotron with His Holiness. And I'm kind of hungover because I was drinking every night. And all of a sudden, like on the second day, I feel a voice in my head. And it's His Holiness, and it says, "Michael, hi, how are you?" And I said, I'm okay. I'm a little hungover. I was hungover. I didn't realize that I was having this conversation, and we had this conversation. And he said, "I'd really like to invite you to follow my teachings more closely." And then that happened, and then it happened again the next day. And by then I went, wait a minute, am I going crazy? What is this? I called the people that sponsored him, and they said, no, that's called mind transmission. So they have the power through the development of their subtle body and the chakras and all of that at a very sophisticated level to enter the mind stream of anybody they want. And he had entered my mind stream. I could actually have a conversation with him, and periodically I still do. But at that time, I was like blown away. And the facilitator said, yes, you had mind transmission. You need to follow his instructions. So within 10 months, I then got tickets because I teach in Switzerland a lot. And there's a lot of Tibetan refugees in Switzerland. They were the first country to take in Tibetan refugees in the 50s. When the Chinese flushed him out of Tibet. So he comes to Switzerland a lot. So there I am, I've got tickets. I'm in a basketball arena. Again, it's in Zurich. And I'm in the nosebleed seats because I don't need to be that close. But his initiation ceremony is called Chen Rei-Zi. And the Dalai Lama is considered to be the reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara. And Avalokiteshvara is one of the original followers of the Buddha, like one of the 12 apostles, we could say. And he's the saint of compassion. And so the Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of the saint of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. In Tibetan, it's called Chen Rei-Zi. So that's the Tibetan word for the saint of compassion. So I went through the ceremony of Chen Rei-Zi, and I got linked to him being a student. And then I was given a job because the lineage the Dalai Lama runs is called the Gelugpa lineage. It's the scholarly lineage. So I then had to get hooked up with a Buddhist scholar, a wonderful man from Harvard. And for about 5 years, I did scholarly work editing very esoteric texts in Tibetan Buddhism. And then in 2011, I formalized the last phase of having him as my guru at a ceremony in Washington, D.C. It was called the Kala Chakra Tantra. And it's a very sophisticated, high-level Sanskrit and Tibetan teaching. And it's where you get linked mind to mind with him. But in this case, what he said was, your instructions now for the rest of your life are to stay in your heart, follow your heart, and start a center for the study of the human heart, which is what I did. That's all I do now. My whole life, my whole world is oriented around that. And I have a set of prayers and so forth that I do every morning in terms of the linkage I have with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So you're getting long stories, Tim, but
it's amazing.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm just very extremely grateful. I say that he saved my life because I was not in good shape mentally and emotionally after my mother died. And drinking is not good for an Irish liver. It's not good for anybody's liver, but on the other hand, I was headed for a depression. It was not good. He saved my life spiritually. I am forever, ever indebted to him for that opportunity.
Well, and that growth is exponential because you're a healer and a teacher. Like, yeah. look where that, like, how many lives have you touched? I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
It is pretty, I'm so grateful. I have about 500 students a year that I work with. And even during the COVID thing, when I wasn't in the classroom, the Zoom industry, you and I are on it right now,
Yep.
but the Zoom industry took off, and it's incredible what you can present. And I could even present the hands-on work that I do and meditation. So I maintained a contact with about 500 students a year and still do worldwide.
So that brings us to biodynamic craniosacral therapy, which,
Yep.
like I said, I didn't know anything about it. And I went for a session and I told the therapist, she's like, well, why are you here? I said, I really don't know, but I'm just trying to learn what you do. I said, because I'm interviewing this guy on my podcast named Dr. Michael Shea. She goes, what? I said, yeah. She goes, well, he wrote my book. And she's like, all right, well, this is going to be fun. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. And it was very neat. And all I can tell you from my session, because she's like, well, set an intention and like she tried to explain what we would do. But in the actual session, I kept wondering, like, is her hand inside of my body or did my body like just melt over her hand? And like I had thoughts like that. And then I had this one realization. I was like, I bet I am only breathing 1 to 2 breaths a minute. And that was like, but that was as far as I got, because I was like, wow, I'm like barely breathing. So but that was my experience, right? So
Right.
now my question to you, what is biodynamic craniosacral therapy? And what happened to me during that session?
Well, I don't know what happened to you,
I
but
don't either.
Tim, what happened to you anyway?
I was very relaxed and breathing very, very slow.
Well, I think, realistically, because even students, I just came back from St. Louis and I was more or less, it was kind of a basic class. And, the students say, well, what do I tell my clients that come to me, and what do I tell them I'm doing? And that's the first thing. We got to relax. And so it is a relaxation therapy, and a lot that may seem trite, but it really is. I mean, the culture we live in, people are just not so relaxed. They're extraordinarily uptight, I should say. I'm shocked by what I'm seeing in the United States and worldwide in Europe, because I just taught I taught a class in Edinburgh, Scotland in March, and then I taught 3 classes in Switzerland not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. I'm shocked at the level of ill health. So biodynamic craniosacral therapy. Let me just give you a quote.
Okay.
The founder of osteopathy, Andrew Taylor Still. So not all of it, but a lot of this work in that lineage. And there's many lineages, there's many shoulders that I stand on, from Native American lineages to other lineages. But Andrew Taylor Still was the founder of osteopathy. And so he said, find the health, anyone can find disease.
That's strong.
Very strong. Now, so the job of a biodynamic therapist is to find the health. In the midst of an ocean of ill health and an ocean of metabolic inflammation, disruption, psychological problems galore. 5 of the students in my class last weekend had children who in the last several years threatened suicide. I mean, there's an epidemic of pain and suffering that's out there. And so the biodynamic therapist acknowledges this, and we are trained to hold that level of pain and suffering because we know how to feel the heart. So the heartbeat in the research increases empathy if you consciously can feel your heartbeat. So part of the training in the biodynamic world is to feel your heartbeat, because you've got to ignite empathy. You've got to ignite empathy for yourself and for other people. Research is very clear. Tim, it's that simple. If you can consciously feel your heartbeat, some people have to take their pulse first, but you can feel it in the middle of the night when you wake up to pee or whatever. You're laying there and you can feel your heart pounding. So that's part of the dynamic of feeling your heartbeat, we ignite empathy. We start that process. And then it gets into where do we place our attention to find the health? Where do we place our attention? And it turns out in the biodynamic model, and I'm in my book that I just wrote, it's going to be more associated with the elements of wind and space and so forth. So there's two elements that we have to put our attention on as biodynamic therapists: stillness and slow movement. So we feel our heartbeat, we tune into our breath. We don't deliberately slow our breath. Tim, it doesn't make any difference if you're a fast breather or a slow breather or whatever kind of a breather you are. You have to start with just awareness of your breath. You became aware that you're a fast breather. So just stay with that awareness and see how it shifts. Just stay with awareness without deliberately needing to shift or change it. You can. The internet's awash with breathing techniques. So the thing is, when a biodynamic therapist sits still, then you begin to feel really quiet down. So the stillness is associated with just a sense of awareness, a panoramic awareness that things have quieted down. And then from there, there's a slow movement from the third ventricle of your brain out to the horizon. Your nervous system is orienting to the horizon. So we look at the horizon and we begin to feel a movement. And it's documented a number of different ways, but it's this, we call it primary respiration. The teachers in our world call it primary respiration. It's also called the tide or the long tide and so forth. And it's a movement between the horizon and the third ventricle of the brain. It's very stabilizing. And then we drop the fulcrum down to the heart. And then we feel a heart-to-heart connection with our therapist from this movement of primary respiration in the heart. It's a subtle movement. It's linked to the breath, and you got to be still. So the training requires a lot of meditative capacity to get to that level of quietness. But the HeartMath Institute has already shown in an animation and measured the frequency of that long tide from heart to heart. So it's a real thing. And when you associate that with loving kindness and empathy and compassion, so there's a mental attitude of gratitude and so forth. And so that takes a lot of training to couple. It's called synchronizing with stillness, synchronizing with the movement of your heart and the slow movement heart to heart to share and spread that empathy between two human beings. And that's the health. The health is the stillness and primary respiration. So find the health, and then we begin to explore how that actually is a movement in the client's body. And that movement in the client's body has its own orientation. It has its own intelligence. I don't have to direct it. So I get to sit and observe it and observe how it functions. So, and the health then can increase. So we know if we're in touch with the health because it has a certain level of potency. It gets stronger. That movement gets stronger. The stillness at the end of a session gets deeper. It gets really, really deep. And you can get into these mystical states. All of the lineage holders in osteopathy were Christian mystics. And that's worthy of a pause, just thinking about that right there. And what's happening now is because of the spiritual orientation that we desperately need on this planet, and a spiritual orientation that repairs our gut in order to repair our heart. We have to repair our heart at the physical level and the spiritual level. They go hand in hand. So we have to come into that relationship with a level of spiritual healing. And Christian mysticism now is extremely valuable, but I teach two other cosmologies as well. So I teach the cosmology of Judeo-Christian cosmology and the Taoist cosmology, and then the Tibetan medicine cosmology, because I've studied Tibetan medicine for 40 years. So we have a sense of that originality and a sense of origin and beginning, and we implement that in terms of stillness and slow movement.
This is really, really, it's just neat. The one thing I thought about, like if I were going to compare it to any other thing I've ever experienced, when I did my session, it reminded me of being in a float tank.
Yeah.
And like, but the I'm sitting there wondering, but I'm not in a float tank, but it felt very much like there's so many similarities about it.
Yeah.
Which was very nice. But it was just neat to me that I was lying on a table, right, with, and another person was there, and she started at my feet and like worked her way around to my head. But all I could think about was like how slow I was breathing, and it felt just like I was in a float tank, which again was very not unpleasant.
Well, that's part of the other teaching. So the biodynamic model is divided into theory, perception, and we've talked a lot now about perception and just a little bit about the theory, because embryology and cosmology is part of the theory. But the palpation skills are very unique, because the first palpation skill we learn is how to come in to relationship with the early embryo. It turns out that the human body right now, Tim, is 92% water. Now, some books will say 78 or 84, but the newer German research says that 92% of the body is the water molecule. It turns out that the human embryo is 98 to 99% water. So the first thing we do is we put our hands under the client, wherever that might be, or over the client, and we just imagine that we're holding an aquarium or the ocean or this massive body of water, which it is. And in biodynamic work, it's called the fluid body. So the water body. So that's the first thing we come into relationship with. We touch the embryo, and we touch the embryo's original wholeness as it was. And it can start to breathe. You can feel how that aquarium starts to breathe with that slow tempo of primary respiration. It's in all living things. It's been measured in all living things. So but you can't see it, but you can feel it. And that's what we train the therapist to do.
That's really neat. And last thing about me, when she got around to my head and she had cradled my head during the session, it was weird. It was as if I shrunk down to a small kid, and it was, then I'm thinking like, wow, why do I feel like now I'm a small child, like 4 years old or something? That was the weirdest thing. It was random, but it was it was a very neat experience overall, for sure.
Right. Yeah. So when you say you shrank, does that mean you actually physically felt as if your body was smaller, or you were having a retrieved memory from childhood?
It was definitely something inside of me. I didn't feel like my body got smaller. I felt like some space inside of me, or my head, my brain, my mind got smaller. Weird. It was weird.
Right. Yeah. Well, Tim, you felt your embryo.
Maybe so.
Yeah, this work allows you to feel your embryo in that small, center, wherever you might have felt it in your body. And some people, they come off the table and they've touched their embryo. Of course, they're not going to say I felt my embryo,
right,
but they're going to say something like what the experience you had, and then they may associate it with a feeling or emotion, and just whatever that might be for people.
No, that was very, very, very cool. So that was, if you're listening, and you have a practitioner near you, Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy, there's actually a website that you can go to find a therapist near you, correct?
Yes, the Biodynamic Craniosacral Therapy Association of North America, BCTANA. I don't know. Is it .org or I think it's .org.
We'll put the notes in the show. We'll make sure that we have it right.
Thank you.
All right. So your new book, Biodynamics of the Immune System.
Right.
How long has that been out? That's pretty recent.
The book was just released at the end of January, so it's only a couple of months old. Yeah.
Now, everything we've been talking about, is this for the practitioner or the person that
Both,
wants to be healthy?
both, both. Tim, I wrote this book to save lives. 12 years ago, I started writing it with my sister. My sister runs the Intestinal Health Institute in Tucson, Arizona. And we saw already in the emerging literature 10 to 15 years ago where public health was going, and it was going in the direction of what's called metabolic syndrome. And now we know that we are already in the pandemic, and we already know that the folks that died from COVID, the majority of the people that died from COVID, they had an underlying condition of metabolic syndrome. So what'd they die of? Well, the death certificate is going to say COVID, but they really died from metabolic syndrome. So that book made it all the way to the editor, a publisher, and then they rejected it for whatever reason. But now I got it revised because we are now in the age of the immune system. This is the system of the body that is the most dysfunctional, that is the most disrupted. And that's why so many people are having a challenge with their health. So many people died from COVID. So many people are having challenges with vaccine side effects and so forth. I follow all of this literature, and not just locally here in the United States, but internationally through a wide variety of different medical feeds. So I wrote the book to save lives and to start telling my story. I had a metabolic syndrome. I was morbidly obese. That is a metabolic syndrome. And I thank God that when I got out of the service and I got involved with my sister in this raw food commune in New York City, that I could learn in my 20s to start doing the overhaul necessary, the repair of the gut, the repair of everything. I mean, from what I'd been through. And it changed every decade. There's something new that I have to change and work on, but that's life. We all have to do that. So we're in the age of the immune system, and there's some really good contributors in the book. My wife contributed 2 chapters because we work with a very specific medical paradigm from where we teach at in Switzerland. Dr. Thomas Rao, MD, and his Biomedicine International model. And so finding the health, you also have to find a model in order to begin getting into how do I do the repair necessary, because most people need to start the repair, the inner repair of their body and their mind through a contemplative practice. But one feeds the other. You can't have one without the other.
Right. Absolutely. And yeah, because everything is connected and you can't separate anything out from the rest of you, right? Which, and I noticed on one of the write-ups about you talk about the post-COVID age.
Right.
How has, or like, I know it seems like we're on the other side of COVID, but there's a lot of people still hurting from what happened during COVID. Like, so my son goes to North Carolina State University, and this year they had 14 suicides on that campus, which is mind blowing to me. Like that shouldn't happen.
Right.
But there's obviously types of hurt and trauma that we're missing. Like, and that young people, and it's not just young people, but they're not, to me, they're just not long enough in the tooth to have another way to cope or whatever. And they take their lives, and it's just, it's so sad, and horrible.
Right.
But I can't help but think that a lot of this is effects of COVID and just not being able to heal, or, like, so can you speak to any of that?
It's such a difficult question to grapple with, suicide. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of the show here that I just finished a class in which 5 of the students had children between the ages of 10 and 16 who had threatened suicide. And the reason I mentioned it is that the night before, one of the students had their son threaten suicide. And I wanted to read the note because it was a note that was sent, and it was just stunning, the level of depression, the level of rage. I think we have to understand that we're also seeing a lot of rage in the culture. COVID brought forth a lot of rage. I had a year's worth of rage when it all started. I was pissed that they closed the beach, blah, 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 blah. I had all my blah, blah, blah for my rage. But then I realized that I can't do rage. It's not good for my heart. And the only way out of this in the age of COVID or even post-COVID is a spiritual path. And so I really am dedicated to the spiritual path, which is also getting to know the body. But back to suicide. Suicide, the level, and again, it's indicative of the level of depression and the level of psychological challenges that our culture is up against, in that these rates of suicide and these rates of depression are increasing. They are not getting better. So we've got a mental health system that's broken. We have a food system here in America. It's broken. We've got a medical system. I'm sorry, it's for the most part broken. So I was in Zurich, and I got asked if I would be interviewed for a documentary film on cancer. Tim, I've never been involved with cancer patients because, that's such a medical thing, and they don't come for biodynamic work, unless they're working on some aspect of it or they get medically cleared to have biodynamic work. But in the last 6 months, all of a sudden, I've got this huge influx of cancer patients. And it's the same thing I told the class, when your children are threatening suicide. I told the filmmaker, I said, there's only one thing I have to say about cancer, or there's only one thing I have to say, when the child threatens suicide. It requires you to turn inward. You have to go inward. And we live in a culture that we've abdicated authority and control and responsibility for our body. We've outsourced it to everywhere. We have lost our body agency. We have lost the sovereignty and the dominion over our body. And that means we've lost it over our mind as well. And the hardest thing to do when you're working with folks that have children that have threatened suicide, that have just gotten the diagnosis of cancer and had the fear of God, and they're shaken like that. Because I work in a cancer clinic in Switzerland, that's where I teach. So we mingle with the patients and we see what's going on. And it's the turn inward, Tim. And so you can't oversimplify this. I can't oversimplify it. And here we are on a podcast, but I just want to invite the reader, if you want dominion over your body and you want to have an understanding of why this is happening in the world, you must turn inward. You must repair your intestines. The majority of psychological problems now, according to research literature that's been out for 20 years and it's getting better, the majority of psychological problems are co-rooted. Some would say 100%, but co-rooted in the microbiome of our intestines. And in that Swiss biological medicine model, the second part of the repair that's necessary for our body is to repair the microbiome. And that requires a turn inward, because it requires a turn inward in terms of eating real food and getting away from processed food. And that's a major part of the first part of my book. So it's the turn inward, and then having a contemplative skill. If you have a child that's threatened suicide, the first thing you have to do, you have to grapple with your fear. You have to grapple with your fear of losing that child, and taking that threat seriously and doing what is necessary to evaluate that threat and getting that child the help they need. So that's a big learning curve. But the turn inward is, I've got to work with my fear. What are the action steps I need to take right now if my child has threatened suicide? Okay. And that might mean repairing my own body and my own mind first, and repairing this is a family system problem. So I studied family systems in systems theory, but Tim, the kitchen is the new emergency room. It's the new ER. This is, I say it in the book, the kitchen used to be the hearth. It used to be the center of compassion in all households developmentally for thousands of years. And now people don't even know how to cook. They don't even know how to cook, and they're eating a lot of processed food. 70% of the food Americans are eating is processed. And the European medical community is really clear. Cancer and these serious problems are all rooted in a disorder of the small intestine and the gut. That's where they're rooted. So we have to start putting our attention there in the gut in order to allow the heart to spiritually come alive. Because when you eat processed food, these psychological problems are caused because of the inflammation. There's a pathway. You eat the processed food, you disrupt the barrier, you start destroying the cells in the microbiome. All of this creates inflammation, and the immune system upregulates and spreads the inflammation everywhere, and especially the brain. And then the arteries in the brain start getting disrupted in their flow of nutrition, and they can't get the waste products out from the cell. You're going to have psychological problems. You're going to have depression. So are all of these problems rooted in the gut? I would say most of them have a source in the gut that you need to take care of. And yes, there are other circumstances in people's lives that they have to take care of, whether it's their career, their job, their spiritual path, all of that. But you've got to include the body. And it starts with taking dominion, taking control over your body. Tim, it's incredible. I have just counseled 2 people in the last month who lost their children, age 37, age 38, to colon cancer. Both of these kids appeared to be healthy. Both of these kids were exercising. One was climbing a mountain, wake up the next morning, not feeling so well. Wake up the next morning, can't move. Go to the emergency room, dead in 4 weeks from colon cancer. The rates of colon cancer and autoimmune diseases and psychological problems in the age group under 50 years old is now increasing exponentially. It's out of control. So these kids are committing suicide on college campuses. It's incredible of what's happening.
Dr. Shea, you're singing my song. The book is Biodynamics of the Immune System. Where can people buy this book?
My publisher would like me to say, you could get it at any bookseller, but Amazon US has it for $31. I mean, you can get it really inexpensively. Originally, this book was supposed to be $100 to $150. It's the value of the information in it puts it in a category or classification for that high of a cost. And we agreed that to save lives, we have to make it available. So $31 is a bargain, Amazon.com.
Do not pass go. Do not collect $200, but go straight right now to your favorite book retailer. If it's Amazon, great. And get this book, Biodynamics of the Immune System. This has been wonderful, Dr. Shea. I really, really appreciate you being on the show. I've got one more question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I'm going to get, and you don't know this, but I ask all my guests if they like peanut butter. So I'm going to ask you.
First of all, Tim, the answer is yes, I love peanut butter.
Thank goodness.
But the second answer to that is I've got a wife who knows more about nutrition than I do. And actually I'm in her nutritional studio right now. And she's got this anti-peanut thing So I can't even bring it into the house. So I'm in St. Louis last weekend. I'm eating peanuts. I'm eating peanut butter. I mean, I have my peanut butter orgy, when I leave the house. But I also do a lot of nut butter. So I do a lot of nut butters because it's a great source of ketone bodies and fatty acids to feed the brain. So I have a wide variety, but I'm not allowed to bring that peanut butter into the house, but I love it.
Oh, I really like you. Oh, so thank you very much for that. You just made my day right there. I
Yeah,
love it.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, Dr. Shea, again, thank you so much for being on the show. This was fantastic.
Tim, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Now get outside and play.